made things a little. I'm grateful to see everybody here in the room. I know we have a lot of people that are on Zoom tuned in from all over the country, potentially all over the world. So this is a really huge honor for me to introduce Dr. Myerson. Most of you in this room and joining by Zoom know him, know of him, and know everything that I'm about to tell you. Mark joined us about 6 years ago, moved out to Denver, and we were very fortunate to have him join our department, primarily in the capacity to teach fellows, residents, and faculty, and to conduct research. And it was just such a pleasure to have you as a part of our program. Mark, as you all know, is one of the foremost leaders in foot and ankle surgery. He has influenced so much of what we do and how we practice. He has influenced so much of the literature, and he is such a passionate person, surgeon, individual, chef, host. He's one of those people that really is great at everything he attempts. And I even skied with you, and you were a great skier. I was just taking that up a little bit later. So he's really a remarkable person. He's an incredibly accomplished scientist and surgeon. He is world renowned for not just his academic work, but for the work that he does. His current primary focus and passion is Steps to Walk, which is an organization he founded 25 years ago, and continues to run to this day. And they are now in 23 countries, sorry, 23 countries. I was fortunate to join them in India a couple of years ago, and it was an incredible experience for residents and fellows. If you're interested, it's really a tremendous opportunity. So he continues to run that organization and continues to be very active in research as well. So after his 6 years with us, his wife, Dr. Lee, who is our former fellow, is just starting her practice at the University of Texas. And so we will miss her greatly, but Mark is going to plan his transition there as well. So we started this lectureship in his name. And the idea here is, because of Mark's international prowess and experience, is to bring in surgeons, foot and ankle experts, ideally from international locations, to speak to us every year. So this lectureship will continue, and every year in perpetuity. And we're very fortunate to have Mark as our first Mark Myerson lecturer to talk about lessons learned in his career. So Dr. Myerson, please, welcome.
So this is a hell of an honor. I mean, really, for me to be here and give an inaugural address and lectureship in my own name feels pretty cool. And thank you, Ken E. Berger, and the entire department for initiating this, as you've already said, in perpetuity. I'm going to talk a little bit in general about myself. It's a little different from the grand rounds that you residents typically hear on topics that, are just minutiae, and I want to share with you my life, my experiences, a little bit about philosophy, and I'll bring foot and ankle topics into it during the course of the presentation. So let's take a look here. So following my medical school training and work as a resident in Cape Town, South Africa, I came to the United States in 1979 to Baltimore, Maryland, where I finished off my residency, and I began my career in foot and ankle surgery in Baltimore after my fellowship in the early 1980s. Then 10 years ago, I decided to leave hospital practice and start a global humanitarian organization, which we'll talk about a little bit. So you'll see my sort of movement from Cape Town to Baltimore, and then 6 years ago, we arrived here in Denver, and it's been a wonderful experience, a really fabulous way for me to change career, and then in some aspects end my professional and academic career. Now, my formative years as a foot and ankle surgeon began as a fellow in New York with Professor Melvin Joss at the Hospital for Joint Diseases, where curiously, 40 years later, my son Lucas did his fellowship. He's now practicing as a shoulder and elbow surgeon in New York, which is, I couldn't get him interested in foot and ankle. So Mel Joss, my mentor, was a really quirky individual, a cynical man. He was at the time the editor-in-chief of Foot and Ankle International. Now, he had a pile of papers that had been submitted because nothing was submitted electronically. You had to send it in paper, a pile of them on his desk. And he never believed a word that was published. He's the editor of Foot and Ankle International. And the one thing that he taught me, and I think this applies to all of us, is that don't believe everything that you read. Try and prove it to yourselves and that it works for you. That's important. The other mentor in my life was my father, Peter. He was an artist. And he died 5 years ago at the age of 93. You can see my mother in the middle. She lives alone and is 95 today. And from both my parents, I experienced the immense love of family and an appreciation for sharing what I have with others, something which I've applied throughout my life, extending hospitality to others, friends, visitors, and of course, in particular, to my residents and fellows. During my formative years in the early 1980s, the giants of foot and ankle were Michael Coughlin and Roger Mann, who were friends and real role models in the early part of my career. I want to talk a little bit about building relationships. These major events where our past fellows all got together from all over the world could not have taken place without friendship. After all, friendship is the true meaning of the word fellowship. And my thanks go to all of my past fellows from around the world who continue to participate in our global alumni programs and events. You know, the ability to share life experiences and open my home to others has been very important to me, and something that I really began to appreciate as an immigrant to this country in 1979. And I think that fellowship has always been an extraordinary opportunity to share ideas. And most importantly, though, to learn from others. I've always believed, and still do so today, that you cannot be an educator unless you're prepared to learn from your residents and fellows. This is terribly important as an educator, to open yourself up to opportunities and to learn things new from the younger generation. This year's Professor Terry Saxby in Australia, he was my first international fellow in 1987. And at that time, I had no idea how important these foreign fellows would ultimately become and the influence that they would have on my career. Because many of them, like Terry, went on to an illustrious professional and academic career with this cycle of ensuing generations of foot and ankle surgeons over the decades. And I think that from mentoring should come friendship. And I've learned that the best way to engage with others is not in a stereotyped mentor-mentee relationship, but by sharing your passions in life. Passion. Ken mentioned the word passion. And you know that I'm a pretty passionate person, and I'm going to share some of these with you. Education, fellowship, and friendship. These are parallel paths in life, and they really should coexist, not in a stereotyped way. And we should value the opportunity to mentor others. It really is a gift. Think about you, the residents here, the fellows. Think about the impact that you have and that you have today, and that you make a difference in the lives of individuals around you, individual patients. But then imagine how this can be amplified by the expanded role that you have one day as educators, if not now. We all need a place to go where we can lose ourselves. Working in my gardens has been a source of peace, joy, and inspiration to me for decades. It's also allowed me to be creative and to take a different kind of risk without any loss. I have many interests, all of which I do with a passion. Pottery and ceramics being one of them. Here I am in my studio. And actually, you can see my son, Lucas, in the middle here. And I found so much pleasure in the rhythm of my daily work in the studio. I've enjoyed the peace that yoga brings me, but at the same time, I'm reminded of the words of one of my yoga instructors, Mark, yoga isn't a competitive sport. But, you know, that's the nature of perhaps who we are as orthopedic surgeons, to find ourselves, find that peaceful zone, but not to try to compete. Well, maybe not. I think that whatever we do, it really should be done with a passion. I went to cooking school. I embraced it. And for a while, I owned and worked in 2 restaurants where I worked as a chef. And the pleasure of cooking, as those in the foot and ankle world, still today is a very important part of my life. I've tried to find time for my outdoor interests, and staying active and involved in athletic activities and sports has been very important to me. So I ask you all a question. How comfortable are you pushing yourself? You know, crossing that line of your comfort zone. Where do you draw the line with deformity correction for yourselves as foot and ankle surgeons or others? Because the same principles that you apply and embrace in your personal life will extend to the professional realm. Now, I'm not risk averse. Here I'm bungee jumping down into Cape Town in just off Table Mountain, and here hiking in sandals. Any of you know Telluride and the mountains and the surrounding area of Telluride and the San Juan Mountains? Well, that's in San Miguel County. So, you know, I've had many ideas which seemed creative or interesting at the time, but which did not come to fruition. And we really have to find a balance for ourselves. I've had an illustrious professional career and was blessed by opportunity as well as an energy to fulfill these academic interests. But I will say that all of the work, my textbooks and the editing and the journals and so on, I only felt a small part of this, since I saw my success largely through the work that my fellows themselves had accomplished. Over the decades, I found myself drawn more and more in the early thousands to humanitarian service. And by 2007, I was participating in many humanitarian missions annually. I remember this young child in Cali, Colombia very well. She was bitten on the front of her ankle by a snake when she was 1 year old, and then developed a slough, so that this terrible calcaneal valgus deformity is no different from a burn contracture. Now, the one thing that those of you who've treated burns, you know that external fixation and gradual correction is applicable to the majority of these children. We cannot do that on these humanitarian programs. It has to be an in and out, a one-off with very limited resources. So you can see here, as nowadays, I learned to do more with less. And after talectomy, now I had to close the skin on the lateral side, but there's no dermatome available. So you learn to do more with less. In this case, I had to take a split thickness graft or a full thickness graft from her groin, defat it, and then apply it to the ankle. And then I remember this was in 2007. I went back to Baltimore, and the first patient I saw in my clinic the next morning was a lady I treated 2 weeks earlier with a toe deformity. And she was complaining about swelling and she wasn't happy. And I contrasted that with the reality of what I just done on this humanitarian program. And it really put things in perspective for me, encouraging me more and more to humanitarian service. And over the ensuing years, I participated in many more missions and recognized that for me personally, this wasn't an option, but really an obligation, because I found that it really did serve a higher purpose other than gratifying my own personal needs and desires. And I think that we all recognize the need to improve the lives of others. So this took me further on my journey. When I left hospital practice 10 years ago to formally start Steps to Walk, even though we had initiated this about 25 years ago. And our vision was to be a long-lasting legacy. As I've already said, education is of paramount importance. And you all know in this patient with this terrible untreated equinovarus deformity, you can treat this. That's not too difficult. You can give a man a fish, but all you've done is treat one person, one patient. It's not sustainable in humanitarian service. You can alternatively give them a fishing rod, and it's the same with education. In order for the work that we do to be sustainable globally, you have to do two things. You've got to educate, and you've got to go back. It's never a one-off program. So education is of paramount importance, and this is our mission. Surgical care, of course, but educating the orthopedic population. These are the current sites in the world where Steps to Walk is working, and we add 1 to 3 countries annually, and have plans. We should be in 26 countries by 2027. Now, why is our work necessary? You know, these deformities are very challenging, and in the countries where these patients live, they may have to wait years for treatment and may never, ever find that treatment is available. The resources that these patients have access to are very, very limited. And these patients are in desperate need for treatment, and in most countries aren't able to access the orthopedic foot and ankle specialists. I'll give you an example. Chile, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina. In those countries, you've got some of the world's leading foot and ankle surgeons, but patients can't access them. They live in rural areas. The surgeons are in private practice. And it makes life very difficult. You know, last month I worked in Malawi in Africa. It's a small country. It is the fourth poorest country in the world, and certainly the poorest in Africa, with a population of 21 million people and 18 orthopedic surgeons serving 21 million people. That is staggering. So no patient with deformity can get treated because they have to prioritize trauma, and that's all that they can do. So, you know, it's not possible for us to hold these complex humanitarian programs without the participation of our volunteers. Some of you, including Ken, have already participated on our programs, and it's an extraordinarily rewarding experience. We take 4 surgeons on each program, including now residents and fellows. And in the future, we welcome any of you residents who feel that this may be part of your personal and professional experience. Now, this is a very difficult problem that we face. Who benefits the most from surgery? Clearly, children do, those with the more severe deformities. But remember that our mission is to educate. And these are surgeons, when we go to a country, there are anything from 5 to 45 surgeons from that country who are attending the 1-week program. And what are we going to teach them? Are we going to teach them how to take care of these very complex deformities? Or do they need to learn more basic deformity correction, trauma reconstruction? So here's a good example of this. This is a young lady with a terrible equino-cavo-varus deformity. No movement in the foot. I started with a tenotomy of the Achilles and then went to the midfoot. You'll see the apex of the deformity is at the talar navicular joint, if not the navicular, so that I recognize that in addition to correcting the equinus, I had to do a naviculectomy to address the midfoot cavus, which was very rigid. So I took the navicular out. There you can see limited motion. You've got to then decompress the lateral side of the foot. So that's with a large wedge resection at the calcaneal cuboid joint. And then what you're left with is a very nice plantar-grade foot with range of motion in the ankle, which is a really good accomplishment. And then finally, some tendon work to give active dorsiflexion. These deformities can be challenging. Here's another young lady. When I first treated her, she was younger. She has spina bifida with osteo of the lateral side of her foot. This was treated, and then I went back, and you can see her walking here. She's not able to walk. She was wheelchair bound for about a year prior to initiating treatment, and this is what her foot looked like. But there's tremendous possibility, and I'm going to come to this when I talk about the cavus foot. There is possibility to treat these ghastly deformities, and this is done with a combination of tendon transfers, muscle balancing, in this case an arthrodesis, although I rarely use an arthrodesis to treat a cavus foot, Achilles lengthening, and in particular for this, excision of the 5th metatarsal, which is a very important component of some of these cavus foot corrections. And here you can see her walking. When I went back on another program, she came to visit me, and it was a very emotional experience seeing her walking. So our goal is to make a lifelong impact. This is another trial with spina bifida, who's ambulatory, he has hip problems, but you can see terrible calcaneovalgus deformities. So in summary of the humanitarian experience, I think this sums it up. You know, the meaning of life, what is it? To each of us, it's very different, but you've got to find your gift. For the residents here, you've already found your gift. You've been blessed by opportunity. Now, for me, I don't think that you can experience life in full, and particularly what our profession offers us, until you're able to treat somebody who can never repay you or never pay you for the service of what you're doing. And that embraces the humanitarian experience. Here, I'm going to talk a little bit about experience. You know, you look at something, you say, this is damn stupid, but it's not how stupid we think something is. In order to correct a problem, we need to understand it, okay? So that's important. We're not superheroes. We all have to establish our limits. And this, for me, has continued throughout my career. I'd like to talk a little bit about hindfoot deformity, and in particular, focus a little bit on failure. Why does hindfoot deformity correction fail? And there are two principles. Whenever you have hindfoot deformity, there has to be muscle imbalance. It's not possible for there to be either a flat foot or a cavus foot without muscle imbalance. It doesn't exist. So the other is flexibility and rigidity. And the third is where's the apex of the deformity? Because with these three principles, you can correct absolutely anything. So in the 1980s, triple arthrodesis was not considered to be an ideal procedure. And this came out of the work from Wetmore and Drennan. And Jim Drennan was a friend in New Mexico, and Wetmore from Children's Hospital in Wilmington. Anyway, the problem was that they did no tendon transfers. All they did was triple arthrodesis, and they recognized ultimately that you had to do tendon transfers. And if you look at this example here, this is a paper that my son Lucas and I wrote together, or Lucas wrote, and you know, you look at this and say, well, this is a terrible result from a cavus foot correction, lateral overload. And I believe that a triple arthrodesis cannot be performed in isolation. You have to have muscle balance. And, you know, if you look at the result here, it cannot be accomplished, even with that revision triple, unless you do tendon transfers and soft tissue releases. This is a very, very important principle. Here's another way of looking at it. You're all familiar with the Coleman block test. Is the foot rigid or is it flexible? I don't believe in it. I prefer to do a manual examination of the foot and not rely on this test, which is very misleading. So here's a child. I followed this. He had flexibility on the Coleman block test. So all I did was an osteotomy of the calcaneus and osteotomy of the first metatarsal. Not good. This was not successful. The fifth metatarsal is still on the floor. The subtalar joint is still in varus. And the foot, you've got adductus of the forefoot. That's not a good correction. So now we've got a problem. Comes back 6 months later and wants surgery on the opposite foot. It's a difficult problem when you've realized that you've done something that's not ideal. How do you now communicate that to the patient when you want to change your treatment in the subsequent operation? Okay, so I explained this to the family, and this is what I did. It was a completely different approach. This was in the early thousands, where I started to correct the cavus foot at the apex of the deformity. And you can see the result here. It's an outstanding correction. And if you compare the one foot, which is still rotated incorrectly, and this foot, there's a world of a difference. And here you'll see our current approach to most cavus foot deformities through a wedge resection through the midfoot, rotating the cuboid and the lateral column of the foot and fixing it with pins. I will tell you that, you know, all of you are obsessed with internal fixation, with plates and screws and fancier plates. All we have available internationally are pins. There are places where we work where, yes, we do have some screws available. But I've learned, and this has been now over 15 years, that the cavus foot can be corrected even in adults with K-wires. And we are going a full circle, and I suspect that this will continue much to the chagrin of leading orthopedic implant companies. So here, to continue on this, here you can see I'm marking out the midfoot, and I'm doing a wedge resection through the midfoot and cuboid. The final result with the tendon transfer of the posterior tibial tendon and a very nice plantar-grade foot. Another example here, peroneal tendons. So you always transfer the longest to the brevis. You do your calcaneal osteotomy, find the apex of the deformity under fluoroscopy so that you know that you're at the navicular cuneiform joint and center of the cuboid, and you do your posterior tibial tendon transfer. One other additional point is that you can lift the forefoot up even more by pushing down with your thumb on the navicular and then manipulating the forefoot to raise it so that there's less forefoot equinus, and you see that here. Now, the same principle can be applied to the flat foot. In the early 1980s, the only procedure that was done, was an FDL transfer, nothing else. That was all that was published. And that didn't make any sense to me. When I was in practice, I had this young adult, 20 years old, with a flat foot, saw in the literature this paper by Koutsogiannis with a calcaneal osteotomy. And he treated kids and adults just with a calcaneal osteotomy. And I thought, okay, let me apply the bone correction to the principle of muscle imbalance. And that then led to this here, and I published many papers on posterior tibial tendon issues, the flat foot, and so on. But there's nothing like good follow-up to ruin your results. Now, this was a very large study that we published. You can't see the whole paper there, but it was 180 patients with a calcaneal osteotomy and an FDL transfer. But the results began to deteriorate over time. And the reason it deteriorated was muscle imbalance. Because we were using the FDL, it's 1/3 the size and power of the posterior tibial tendon. So from that evolved the peroneal tendon transfer. And I think this is very useful because by transferring the brevis to the longus, what do? You weaken abduction and eversion and strengthen plantar flexion at the first metatarsal, which is really what you want to do. And then I began to recognize that for real muscle balance, why not use the ruptured posterior tibial tendon and its muscle? So I started in the early thousands to do allograft reconstruction of the posterior tibial tendon. But that depends on how long the rupture has been present, because here on the left, you can see a very healthy muscle, and on the right, nothing, fatty infiltration and atrophy. So you can't do an allograft tendon to this, although lessons learned from subscap reconstruction is that there is recovery of that fatty infiltration, and perhaps we should be looking more at this ultimately. You also can't do an allograft when you've got a restricted, stuck down scar tendon. But here's a perfect example of this. You cannot do osteotomies and multiple tendon work in gymnasts, ballet dancers, and athletes. You've got to use what they have. So here she's got a healthy posterior tibial muscle, and here she is 5 months later after an allograft reconstruction, going back to professional dancing on point. We do not see this at all in our clinical practice because patients can barely get up on 2 feet after our traditional reconstruction. Now, I want to talk briefly on how to manage complications. Right? Here's a patient who had 2 attempts, patient of mine, who had 2 attempts at subtalar fusion. What do I say to the patient? So I spoke with him about stopping smoking and compliance and so on. He said, "Oh, no, it's no problem. I'll give up smoking." I said, "Really?" I said, "Okay. When you come back, I'm going to test you. Remember that." So he came back 3 months later and said, "You remember what I told you?" "Yes, doc." Said, well, I'm sending you off now to be tested. And he came back a few hours later, testing positive for nicotine, heroin, and cocaine. So whose responsibility is that? We forget that it's our responsibility. It's not a matter of non-compliant patients. It's the same thing here. When you see complications of hallux valgus correction, this is the surgeon responsibility, even though we say, I told the patient that there were potential complications. That's not good enough. The surgeon responsibility to make sure that patient expectations are realistic. Now, there's a big difference on managing your own complications and one that comes in to see you from somebody else. It's very easy to manage someone else's complications than you're compared with your own. So how do you go about it? Be forthright. These patients need to know what's going on. Don't ever try to hide a problem. Never. If you see something early post-op, address it early post-op. Never delay it. Don't put off the inevitable, which is a revision. Don't do that. Get back as soon as you can and address the problem with the patient and offer the patient a second opinion. You know, in the foot and ankle team, you are all leaders. And amongst the faculty who are here, you're all considered experts. And the patient will say, well, why are you sending me to see somebody else? You're the expert. Well, it's just sharing that opportunity with the patient to be able to see somebody else to confirm what you're thinking. That's all. It changes the psychological play between you and the patient. Be optimistic about the outcome. You know, you have to figure out that taking a step backwards after taking a step forward is not that terrible. It's sort of like this cha-cha dance. And remember, I hate to say this, but have to, there's no room for prayer in managing our complications. Now, when you manage someone else's complications, oh, that's not a big deal, but it is. You've got to be kinder and considerate. And remember, these patients are very frustrated. And their frustration is frequently going to be transferred to you because you're now the caregiver, not someone else. Never mind what somebody else did somewhere else. You're now responsible. And they will forget who did their first surgery or what was done and why it was done. And this anger can be very quickly misplaced. And I want you to be careful with nonverbal communication. It is as important. Now, imagine this scenario. You've got patient is sitting there with this recurrent something or other, and the x-rays come up on the board, and you've got a resident or fellow in the room, and the attending turns and looks and is shaking his or her head, and the resident has got this smile, and the fellow is, you know, the patient is watching you. The patient observes nonverbal communication as much as your attempts to communicate verbally. It's very, very important. The patient is watching you for clues. Be considerate. Understand their needs and that they are frustrated. Here's a good example of this. This is a patient with CMT, and I treated her on her opposite foot and the rest of her family when I was in Baltimore. I was away and I got a call from her mother to say that she had recently been operated on in LA and had a terrible complication with ischemia. So I was coming back from a mission trip. I went to LA to visit her. And here, indeed, she's in a cast with ischemia of her toes. Be considerate. I called the treating surgeon, whom I know, to explain that I was examining her and very gently made some recommendations as to how this could be approached. You need to share this experience with other treating physicians. Remember that. It's not all about you and your experience. It's not just a complication. You need to go back. This may appear to be someone else's problem, but when you review someone else's complications, maybe there's a different perspective. Maybe they were thinking of something else, and you need to understand the difference between that and that. What were they trying to do? What were they trying to say? It's very important. Now, which of these deformities would you prefer to treat? Honestly, yeah, we all want to treat that acute fracture dislocation. None of us want to treat toes, but it's inevitable. I honestly hate taking care of toe deformities. And you can read this. This is, if I didn't have to perform toe surgery, I never would do it. The rate of complications is high. The outcome of routine arthroplasty or arthrodesis is unpredictable. And the exact same technique on one toe and the other foot doesn't yield the same results. And this comes from one of my textbooks. I mean, it's one of the things we have to face. You don't always get to pick and choose. Well, maybe you'll be lucky enough to be able to say, no, I'm not treating heel pain, or I'm not treating toe deformities. Sooner or later, there are things that you're going to have to do. At some point, you also have to be a little creative when there's been a complication. And the question is, are you going to find a balance? Here's a patient with avascular necrosis. Are you just going to try to do a routine arthrodesis, which is not that easy in the setting of avascular necrosis? Creativity and innovation may be important, but at the same time, recognize the importance of predictability for the patient in revision surgery. So here, what I did was a fresh osteochondral allograft, and we've published our results since. I think that there is a role for being creative and innovative in managing some complications. But there is, of course, the decision-making that comes into planning revision surgery. And you sometimes need to do something terribly straightforward. I could have been creative and done something very innovative to correct the hallux here. But an arthrodesis of the hallux is very predictable, and in a patient with a procedure that I know would work. Now, here's one of my complications that really taught me something. This woman was extremely bright. Her husband was the recipient of the Nobel Prize for Physics in the early 90s, and I treated her routine hallux valgus correction. Well, what I didn't recognize was that she had slight neuropathy. And she came back 3 or 4 weeks later and nothing had healed. And it was an absolute disaster. Now, here comes the story. She came back to see me asymptomatic at this point every 6 months for years. And one day I asked her, I said, you have no symptoms, but you come back every 6 months. She said, yes, Mark, I'm going to show my feet to your fellows and keep you humble. Remember that. Yeah. And this really, humility is something I unfortunately lacked. I've learned that over the last decade during a lot of my humanitarian work, to be more humble. Remember, our culture is obsessed with success and its achievement, and failure is not really part of the equation, since making mistakes is often hidden and seen as a human weakness. So try, if possible, to embrace failure. And perhaps the right attitude is a willingness to learn from our mistakes. Now, we need to also remember our successes, but the problem is that we don't always remember our successes. Do you remember over the past 10 years what you did each year on your birthday? No, you won't. But you'll remember the failures. And I know that if I go back in time And I came home after a long day in clinic and I've seen 75 patients. All I can remember are the 2 or 3 patients who had failures. I felt terrible. And I still remember those patients today, but I don't remember my successes because that we consider routine. It's what we expect of ourselves, but you need to learn to embrace failure as well. So we're getting to the end. Be passionate about what you do. You cannot educate others without learning from them. Always teach when you can with a historical perspective. It's something that's very useful. It's not good enough for you to know where to make an incision and how to do what is currently done. You think about how we got here from the past 45 years. If you have the ability, understand foreign languages, because the foreign literature is replete with wonderful ideas. Read the literature, and again, if you can, in different languages. Be humble and accept your limitations. I've been blessed recently by my wife, Xu Yuan, who's now in Texas. This has been a wonderful journey when she began running Steps to Walk with me. I want you all to remember your roots. Mine are in Cape Town, South Africa. This is Cape Town, where I grew up. And there's a wonderful pillar at Cape Point with this sign. It's in the Cape. Find your direction when you can, as soon as possible. Know where you want to go and where you want to be. Don't be complacent about your work. You really are blessed with opportunity to be here. Try to find new challenges in life, always. If you go into practice and 5 years later, you're still doing the same things that you learned during your residency or fellowship, you have failed. You must reinvent yourself. You must try to embrace new ideas during the course of your career. You have, as I've said, been blessed by opportunity and should share your passions with others and learn from others, including, this is to the faculty, learn from your residents and fellows. It's so important in life. So there are many lessons that I have learned during these latter years on humanitarian service. And I think this is probably encapsulated in the words of Mahatma Gandhi, who said that the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. Thank you very much.